Good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled, Are Regulators Driving or Impeding Innovation in Clinical Trials? My name is Aisha Rashid and I will be your X-Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speaker. This webinar is designed to be interactive and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speaker throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, you may send me a message at any time by using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this time, I'd like to thank Creo for putting together the content for this presentation. Creo offers an integrated eSource EDC platform with a built-in network of more than 2,000 sites that use Creo eSource every day. The Creo platform embeds real-time alert logic to build quality and compliance at point of capture. Data is captured once by the site and not re-entered into an EDC system. This delivery model improves protocol compliance, reduces time to market, lowers audit risk, and decreases overhead costs. And now it's a pleasure for me to introduce our featured speaker for today's event. With more than 25 years of experience, Jonathan Andrus brings extensive expertise developing e-clinical services that integrate data and technology to optimize steady execution. As President and COO of Creo, Jonathan is responsible for customer success, sales, marketing, and product development. With Creo's focus on reimagining the clinical trial process, Jonathan is committed to driving innovation, reducing site burden, and challenging the clinical trial data status quo. An active thought leader and presenter, Jonathan is a two-time chair of the Society for Clinical Data Management and currently serves as the Society's treasurer. He is a certified quality auditor, a certified clinical data manager, and a veteran of the U.S. Army Military Intelligence Corps. And now, without further ado, I'd like to hand over the mic to our speaker. Jonathan, you may begin when ready.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, and it's great to be with all of you here today. If I could just get a verbal confirmation that you can see my slides.
Yes, we can indeed.
Excellent. So thank you again for the very nice introduction, and it's great to be here again with the X-Talks team and Creo, and getting to talk today about why I believe that regulators really are helping to drive innovation in clinical trials. Just by way of background, kind of the genesis behind this webinar, back in October, I was asked at the Society for Clinical Data Management annual conference in San Diego to basically present, although we had no slides, cases both for sponsors, for vendors, for CROs, and for regulators, and to talk about who we believed were the ones that were really driving innovation in clinical trials. It's probably no secret that my focus, I was given the gauntlet of kind of standing behind firmly that regulators were really part of the driving force behind driving innovation within clinical trials. And so out of that was born essentially this webinar based on those speaking points and those kind of bully pulpit conversational items that were discussed at that particular conference back a couple of months ago now. It was interesting. I won't tell you who ended up winning the argument, if you will. Some people came with flash and dressed as characters from Ghostbusters, and it was an entertaining exercise. But my intent here today with all of you is to talk through, of course, introduce you to a little bit to who Creo is, talk about kind of crucial conversations and crucial changes that are really absolutely needed right now in industry. And then looking at kind of the major phases of a clinical trial, right? Study design, study conduct, study closeout, and looking at ways in which the regulators are either impeding or promoting or pushing innovation in these different phases of the clinical trial process. And then, I think most importantly, I always enjoy webinars where there's something that is actually tangible and actually tied to real life examples. And so towards the end of this webinar, we're going to talk about a specific case study surrounding single sign-on, or what's also known as SSO. And then of course throughout, I think there was already a message put into your screen there to please feel free to ask questions throughout in the chat box there, as mentioned by our moderator from X-Talks. So without further ado, we have an initial poll question, which I believe my hostess will be providing to you.
Indeed, we do have a poll question coming up for our audience to interact with in real time, and that poll question should be appearing on your screen right now. And the question that we have for you from Creo is, what is your current role? We just want to get a feel for what our audience, the areas that our audience is working in. So please choose from one of the following options that we have here. And the options are regulatory QA, clinical operations or project management, data management, data science or biostatistics, PI or site coordinator, or other. Once again, what is your current role at your organization? So please take a moment to select from the given answer choices, and we do greatly appreciate your participation for this poll question. I'm just going to give our audience a couple of more seconds to get their votes in. I do see that the votes are indeed coming in, so thank you very much once again to our audience for participating in the poll question. I will then close up the poll and share the results momentarily.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. All right, it looks like most of our audience has indeed voted. So once again, thank you so much for doing so. I'm going to close up the poll and share the results. All right, so 25% of our audience responded that their current role is in regulatory QA. 13% are in clinical operations, project management. 6% are in data management, data science, biostatistics. 6% are PI/site coordinator, and 50% responded other. Once again, thank you so much for your participation. It's back to you, Jonathan.
Great, how mysterious. Do I need to reshare, or you can see my?
Yes, we can see your presentation, so go right ahead.
Excellent, thank you very much. So just briefly on Creo, I know our host and moderator today talked about some information about Creo, but just to touch on this, I think it's important to note that Creo, as the leading site solution provider, we are embedded now in over 2,000 research sites. We've been involved in, at this point, I think nearly 7,000 research protocols across 800 different sponsors. And most interestingly, especially over 23, we've seen our country involvement really expand pretty dramatically as more and more research sites around the world are interested in doing things in a electronic, compliant, and quality-minded way for collection of eSource data. Just a couple of things from Creo's leading the industry in innovation. And again, I know we're here today to talk about whether or not regulators are driving or impeding innovation, but organizations like Creo, we first started out back in 2016. Raymond Namizu, as our co-founder, current CEO of the organization, was really the first company to release a widely used site-based. And I think that's what's really important here. It's a site-based, site-focused eSource solution, as opposed to other eSource solutions that may exist out there but they're typically sponsor pushed, sponsor provided e-source solutions, as opposed to sites going over and above and going out and acquiring a Creo solution to bring in-house for their own organizations to drive innovation within their research sites. By 2018, we came out with an e-source and finance integration, and that was really to automatically tie our revenue and costs associated with running a clinical trial to those completed source procedures to, again, give sites the ability to effectively and efficiently bill sponsors and CROs for the work that they were doing. In 2018 also, we came out with an integrated electronic delegation of authority that tied that together to delegated duties. In 21, we had our study design marketplace, which provides our customer base with the ability to go out and actually purchase pre-built studies, again, just to help streamline and make the clinical trial development process even more efficient. 23 was a busy year for us. Obviously, we're still in 23, although wrapping up here shortly. We introduced a medical records on demand integration, where we now have access to over 90% of healthcare institutions, where sites can receive records in minutes as opposed to potentially days or weeks if they're writing away to medical research institutions to get those records back. And then finally, Creo Connect, which is really providing sites the opportunity to showcase their abilities, to showcase their strengths to potential sponsor organizations, almost like a bit of like a dating app, if you will, for sites and sponsors to kind of get together. Sponsors are looking for these kinds of profile sites. Sites are looking for these kinds of sponsor opportunities, and it's really it's a platform to connect, hence the name, these both the sites and the sponsors together in a way like that. And then some other things that are coming up. We have a new eSource user interface that is going to be rolled out shortly. We continue to optimize our finance platform, and another area is in and around our partner directory, where we want to provide opportunities for our partners to be able to essentially share their services and products to site and sponsor organizations as well. So that's just a little bit about Creo. We do have one more poll question, and this is the last one, I promise. So after this, you can not have to worry about answering any, but we'll turn it back to our X-Talks team to initiate the poll.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yes, we do have another poll question for our audience to vote on, and that should be appearing on your screen right now. And this question is asking, who is most responsible for impeding innovation in the industry? And the answer options that you may choose from include regulators, sponsors, or CROs. Once again, the question is, who is most responsible for impeding innovation in the industry? So please take a couple of moments to submit your vote for this question. Once again, your participation is greatly appreciated.
Yes, indeed. Thank you all.
Yes. And so I can see that the votes are indeed coming in, which is great. I'm just going to give our audience a couple of more seconds to get their votes in, and then we'll close up the poll and take a look at the results shortly.
Awesome.
Once again, the question is, who is most responsible for impeding innovation in the industry? All right, it looks like most of our audience has voted, so thank you very much for doing so. Let's take a look at the results of our audience poll. So 50% of the audience responded that regulators are most responsible for impeding innovation in the industry. 14% said sponsors, and 36% responded with CROs. Once again, thank you very much to our audience for participating. And Jonathan, what do you think about those results?
Not surprising, quite frankly. I think there is sometimes illusions that exist out there that certain parties in the clinical research process have always historically been viewed as the bottleneck, right? As the role that kind of stifles us to move forward. And so I hope by the end of this today that people may have a different interpretation of that as I kind of elucidate on some items here today during the webinar. So thank you again for the polls and for managing that. I appreciate that. Again, just there is a Q&A box as well, so please feel free to use that as we go through the slides, and then at the very end of this, right, we'll have an opportunity to go over each of the questions and provide some answers. I couldn't help but not start with a quote from George Bernard Shaw, because sometimes I think in conversations that we have, especially around study design and how we go about designing a trial for implementation, that sometimes we think that communication has taken place, right? We hear something from someone and we just assume that it's gospel, that it's based upon something that actually does exist. So, I couldn't help but not include this quote that sometimes the single biggest problem in our communication with each other is that illusion that it has actually taken place. People talk a lot. I think sometimes we're always thinking of our next rebuttal before we actually process what we're actually hearing. And so I think, this topic itself is probably one of the ones that sometimes we think the communication around innovation and where it's being driven from and where it's coming from is this illusion that in fact it has taken place. And so as we talk today, I felt very strongly that it's really time for a crucial conversation to happen. I chose this. This is an actual book. You're more than welcome to purchase it. It's actually a book that we're using internally here within our own organization, CREO, for my management team, our people programs director. She brought this to us, and it's something that I have actually found to be a great book to help not only in work situations, but also even in family dynamics. As we come into the holiday season, sometimes these crucial conversations can get raw, can get emotional, can get different things around the stakes being high, right? And you can see these crucial conversations often involve opposing opinions. They often are embedded with strong emotions, and a lot of times there's very high stakes at play. And this is certainly the case within clinical trials and how we want to go about making sure that we can reach the most diverse patient population and do so in a way that's compliant with the regulations and compliant with expectations. So, it's important to have that crucial conversation with your study team and how you're going about deploying your studies. I think, in my opinion, many times organizations can sometimes hide behind regulatory perceptions that are in fact not fact-based. And so as we have this crucial conversation today and talk about where I believe, the regulatory bodies are actually calling out items that we in industry should embrace and look forward to implementing within our clinical trial programs and break down these perceptions, because oftentimes, and by way of background, right, I have been involved in and around operations, data management, quality assurance, computer systems validation. And what I have found time and time again is that people will often speak to best practice or speak to their experience and treat that as if that is the way that it has to be, and not really being based upon or predicated upon specific regulatory guidance or regulatory 21 CFR codified regulations. So again, we need to make sure that we call out and identify perceptions that may exist today and empower each of you on this webinar to take those back to your own organizations and encourage innovations within your organizations, supported by the fact that the regulatory agencies are actually, and this isn't necessarily my opinion because we're going to talk here about facts, that regulatory agencies are actually encouraging innovation to be embraced. As you know, as many of you know, FDA has issued a number of different guidance documents, one of which was around diversity in clinical trials. I mean, FDA is really pushing and promoting further diversity in clinical trials. And I think it's important to note that diversity doesn't, to me, the term diversity really embodies and encompasses doing whatever we can as an industry to reach more patients, to do so in a way that gives them options, more diverse options, more diverse locations for them to be able to come in and visit with a potential clinical trial, and really reach out to help push the diverse patient populations that we need in our clinical trials. And so, from a better approach perspective, and overall, as we think about study design, study conduct, study closeout, people call those different things, but essentially these are the kind of the design and planning stage as we conduct and carry out the study itself, and as we close out. I'm going to drill into each of these as we navigate through these slides here today. At the end of the day, to me, the better approach is in a clinical trial, sponsors, CROs, whomever is involved from a stakeholder perspective, should be and must be focused on really trying to do whatever is possible to collect data once and only what they need. Trust me, over my nearly 27 years now in industry, I've seen this huge preponderance, this huge growth of the amount of data that we collect. And I often sit back and wonder why. Why are we collecting some of these data elements and data variables that at the end of the day, what value are they adding to the primary safety, primary efficacy of a given clinical trial? So we need to make sure that we're also, not only collecting data as least administratively burdensome as possible, but also in a way that we're only collecting what we actually need for our studies. Monitoring, right? We need to be focused on monitoring, but not just sending out clinical research associates just to spend days on site to drive profits and revenue goals for service providers because, quote unquote, that's just what we've always done, right? So very much this philosophy of, well, this is how we carry out clinical trials. These are the functions, the fiefdoms, the groups that we've established, and this is how we do this approach. A better approach really is looking at how can we do monitoring, but to do so in a much more effective, efficient, centralized, least costly manner as possible. And part of that is embracing technologies that sites use day in, day out to collect data without burdening those sites with single study-based technologies. And so what I mean by that is if I'm a site and I'm working on, let's say, 15 different protocols, I very well could be working on potentially 15 different EDC systems that each of those sponsors have come to me and said, hey, Andrus research sites, you're working on this platform for this study. Oh, and I'm working with this sponsor on here, yet they have another system for me to work on. And so we need to do whatever we can to embrace tech that allows sites to use the systems that they use day in and day out to run their research practice without unduly burdening the sites with these single study-based technologies, is what I call them. We also need to make sure that we're focused on enforcing and following predicate rule and not individuals or organizations' own biased and subjective opinions. I've hosted and conducted numerous audits, probably no joke, in the upper hundreds, if not close to 1,000 over my years. And oftentimes auditors and others will come in with their perception, their bias, their subjectivity, as opposed to clearly linking and clearly tying to predicate rule, to guidance, to specific regulation. And so it's important that we enforce and we follow predicate rule, but based on actual regulations and actual guidance, not just on my opinion. Because in fact, my opinion is not a finding, it's my own opinion, unless it's based on something substantive. And then finally, I feel very strongly that we need to seek regular advice, guidance, and direction from regulatory agencies. Never have I ever, in all of my years of being involved in this industry, have found the regulatory agencies being as open and welcoming to questions, to people coming to them. And you'll hear later on in this use case that I'm going to share, it just continues to support the fact that this is in fact the case, that they are open and willing to receive questions, to provide whatever guidance they possibly can. and that there is this openness and willingness that, frankly, I have not seen up until the past few years. Certainly, in the pandemic, post-pandemic world, I've seen it even grow even more in the desire to want to work and collaborate with industry more and more. So let's drive in here on the study design portion. So this first part of the clinical trial process flow. From a study design perspective, of course, regulators, both in terms of guidance and other elements, have encouraged to receive input from patients on study design and get opinions on data collection approaches that are aimed at reducing burdens on all parties. So make sure that as you're evaluating tech, you're evaluating tools, maybe you have an at-home data collection device or something that you want to do, make sure that you're getting input from your patients, your key stakeholders in this process, to make sure that they can weigh in on that this isn't going to be too burdensome for them. Yes, you want them to do it at home, but is it highly complicated, highly complex? And depending on your patient population, it may still make more sense for them to do it on site or under the supervision of someone. So regulators encourage this. Regulators also have worked tirelessly, and I know many of them personally through my interactions within different professional societies and regulatory council involvement that I'm involved with, that they've been working tirelessly on ICHE 6R3 and getting that revision up and running. And they encourage innovative trial designs, really with the intention of driving, again, further driving diverse patient population. They encourage regular consultation and interaction during study design. They encourage the use of risk-based approaches to help reduce study complexity. I wanted to highlight a couple of things here that really over the past 8 years, industry has driven an overwhelmingly high percentage of increase in the number of study eligibility criteria, and an 86% increase in the number of collected endpoints. This goes back to an earlier point I made, but it's really focusing on collecting data once and collecting only the data that's absolutely needed. So in a lot of ways, right, we are, and from an industry perspective, really are to blame for the increased complexity and the amount of data that we collect in clinical trials. And then finally, from a study design standpoint, regulators have continued to create guidance and direction to help embrace that more diverse driven approach. So more study flexibility, even in the latest FDA draft guidance, it talks about the use of home-based data collection, virtual data collection, using HCPs or primary care data collection, and of course using non-traditional research sites like a retail pharmacy as an example. Again, as regulators have encouraged some of these, us to think innovatively around study design. So in closing on the study design aspect, I really feel that oftentimes we as industry create more complexity to help drive more revenue and potentially more fiefdoms within various organizations with whom we work. As we shift over into the middle portion here, the study conduct phase, frankly, what I've seen again is regulators are pleading with industry to apply risk-based approaches to how we conduct our studies. And to date, frankly, at least in my anecdotal experience, both here at CREO as well as prior organizations that I've been involved with, to date, we really haven't changed much at all, I think, with regard to how we apply risk-based approaches, especially around study conduct activities. Regulators have updated ICHE 6, and in fact the monitoring plan section has been updated to add that monitoring should be tailored to the identified risks, to the reliability of the results, and ensure that oversight while considering site capability and burden. And I put a little footnote there that for this next one, where it talks about monitors' responsibilities have been removed, I want to make it clear that really what it's changed to now is that monitoring responsibilities is now described as monitoring activities. And essentially what they're doing in ICHE 6R3 is removing the restriction that it has to be done solely by what we historically have defined as a monitor. because now encourages a combined centralized approach to eliminate some of those countless and expensive and duplicative reviews that we've historically had in place. And it really encourages us to try and abandon those antiquated practices. So, we at CREO really do push and encourage organizations to embrace a centralized clinical data monitoring approach, where it's a single threaded review, where you collect as much data as you can as electronic source, you apply that centralized clinical data monitoring activity to the process, and then, of course, supplement it with the on-site monitoring and the other activities that are necessary. But you can really focus a lot of the study conduct and monitoring activities by a variety of different folks and individuals. For example, wearing my data science or data management hat, they could look at overall data trends, looking at data in the aggregate, pulling data in from all the different sources that are involved in your clinical study, and driving that to make to identify outliers, to identify things that could then be handed off to the monitoring team to follow up directly with the sites. A little further continuation of this conversation around study conduct. Regulators tell sponsors to ensure the data are of sufficient quality to generate reliable results. And frankly, this is a bit of a crucial change from how maybe we've looked at things before, where again, I think sometimes we would try and throw everything into the pot and just cover everything as we possibly could in our study designs. And really what this allows sponsor organizations to do is to define data quality required, and therefore supports more of a proportional approach to how we go about doing verification, validation, and really focusing on what is important rather than focusing on the accuracy of all of the data. There is no absolute requirement that every single data point, data element be SDV'd and reviewed, right? So it's really focusing on the key data relevant to that particular study. The regulators are also encouraging the use of real-world data to help complement traditional clinical trial data, to really provide more of that robust assessment of the overall treatment effectiveness. And what's interesting, and having just returned not long ago from Europe and having had many conversations with regulators from EMA, from BfArM, from the Danish Medicines Agency, from MHRA, you name it, they, at least from a European health data space, and many of you on this webinar might not be familiar with it. I do have links to each of these different initiatives, but they are aiming towards unifying medical record data collection throughout Europe. So having, if I'm in Spain and I get sick and I'm a resident of France, that I have that ability to connect those data together across the different countries. But when it comes to clinical trial data, it's looking for and getting these data together so that they can be used to help identify patient cohorts, patient profiles that could then be identified for inclusion in clinical research. So there's a lot of initiatives and activities going on around the European health data space. And in addition to that, from a conduct perspective, in advancing the member state approval of ICHE 6R3 and working on a number of different initiatives aimed at advancing clinical trials, there is this ACT-EU, which is the Advancing Clinical Trials European Union. Again, further activities going on in this space, again noted there with the links to the different initiatives that are going on, not only in the US, but I did want to share that this is not just a US-centric thing, especially ICHE 6R3, right, is a international harmonized guidance. So certainly beyond the walls or beyond the borders of the United States. From a closeout perspective, regulators are also exploring and providing different and more flexible approval pathways. So things like adaptive pathways, which really allows for that iterative development and getting earlier access to emerging therapies. And they're also helping to drive the availability of those treatments for patients with unmet medical needs. Regulators have published artificial intelligence, machine learning, right? Terms that we hear day in and day out, not only in our industry, but just across the entire world these days. whether it be in some of the recent regulations that have come up around AI and making sure that we put some guardrails around that. But the regulators have actually have some related publications in Europe and the FDA. FDA is actually asking for comments and feedback on a relatively recent one that they just produced, which is the human-led governance, the quality reliability model development, performance monitoring and validation in and around AI. And an interesting tidbit, right? In the FDA alone, there are over 7 programs underway that are focused on artificial intelligence and machine learning. So again, from an innovation standpoint and really trying to push these things, again, from my perspective, regulators really are helping to drive a lot of these things forward. And finally, regulators are placing a stronger emphasis on post-marketing surveillance to really help monitor the long-term safety and effectiveness of drugs, which obviously may require longer follow-up periods. So I wanted to share a case study because, frankly, in this particular case, the situation was that a particular industry organization was trying to impede innovation under the guise of regulatory compliance, right? So there was this understanding or this thought that FDA or the regulators wouldn't allow certain functionality to be used within a clinical trial. So this is a real case study. So in this case, here's some background on what the situation was. Use of a single sign-on for the application of electronic signatures was deemed non-compliant by a non-regulatory agency personnel. And what I mean by that is, when I say non-regulatory agency personnel, I mean QA from a fill-in-the-blank organization. I won't say if they were, a sponsor, a site, or a CRO, but they were a non-regulatory agency QA personnel. So what did we do? We reached out to the Food and Drug Administration and presented what the situation was. We provided background on how SSO works in the context of our application, and we requested the FDA's perspective on whether or not this approach was compliant with the modern day interpretation of 21 CFR Part 11, right, or the approach to electronic signature application. What's shown there on the screen in the graphics is really without SSO and then with SSO. So without SSO, right, I as a user have to individually log in to each of my different applications. And again, it's just some imagery there to show that I have to log in individually to each. With SSO, right, I log in once and my credentials then carry over to each of the different systems and that are connected into the single sign-on methodology and approach. I'm sure many of you on this webinar probably work within the context of single sign-on and probably use it in your day-to-day lives as we speak. So, how does SSO function, right? So we log in, right? Users log in on the screen. They log in with the SSO option versus the standard username password option. An identity provider is used. It's directed to this IDP. They enter their username and password. After you're successfully authenticated, that user is redirected to the specific electronic system in question. In that electronic system, the user opts to sign something within the system. So when they select the electronic signature button or field using the SSO option, the system automatically checks. So it goes back and checks with the IDP, and it confirms whether or not that user session is still valid. That identity provider may not require further credentials if that user exists in the system and they're an active user and they have the rights to perform that action, right? I am a legitimate electronic signer in the system. If the system notices that if that session has expired or the credentials are then required to reactivate that session within the IDP. And so once this check's been performed, that electronic signature is executed and it's applied in the system. So that's how SSO functioned in this particular case. So interesting, we did. So as I mentioned before, right, FDA encourages interaction, it encourages organizations to reach out to them. In this case, we reached out, shared the background, the information around this situation, and FDA came back and said that 21 CFR Part 11 does not specify a particular method to authenticate that user who's executing an e-cig. And it gave some examples, everything from computer readable ID cards to biometrics like a fingerprint or facial recognition, whatever it might be, digital signatures, or I think what a lot of people are used to, a username and password combination. So based on our description of that SSO workflow, it appears that the check performed by the IDP each time the user attempts to sign meets the requirements under, and then it proceeded to make reference to that particular regulation reference. So specifically, and again, I won't read all that to you, but at the end of the day, very quick to respond. They responded immediately, acknowledging receipt, and said that they needed to take it further and discuss beyond, and then eventually came back. Actually, what you see on your screen is essentially identical to what they responded back to us. And then they provided us with some further links to guidances, etc. And of course, offered, and I put it in bold here at the bottom, to please feel free to reach out with any additional questions. And again, this is just, a single case study example to demonstrate that, in my opinion, regulators really are not the ones stifling innovation, that they are producing and providing relevant guidance and regulations and a willingness to converse and talk about any unique study designs or ways in which you're trying to innovate within your clinical trials. So in summary, I'll go back to that George Bernard Shaw quote, right? It's so important that we communicate, that oftentimes misinformation abounds all over the place. Whisper down the lane is rampant. I know that's a silly little phrase, but I heard it from someone who then told it to me, who then told it to them, and by the time it reaches me, there's this whole maybe blown up understanding as to what something does or doesn't need to be. I think the other summary in all of this is that FDA, not only FDA, again, as I mentioned before, I get the privilege of interacting with regulators across the globe, but all of them are open to dialogue and discussion, and in fact have a number of symposiums coming up. There's one coming up in February where FDA, MHRA, and Health Canada are having a face-to-face event in the Washington, D.C. area. And again, that's just one example. There are many others where opportunities exist for us to have dialogue with them. And frankly, from what I've seen, from whom I've talked to, regulators really do want to drive innovation, want us to embrace new novel approaches for how we can make the clinical trial execution process even better. So again, I know we're coming up here with about 15 minutes left in the webinar, and so I certainly want to have time for Q&A, but in summary, my statement at the very top is really embrace innovation. First and foremost, putting your sites first in everything that you do, really looking at what can you do to help limit the amount of burden that they have on them. Have those needed crucial conversations within your study teams, within your organization about what can you do to help drive and stir on and spur on innovation within your studies. Follow the lead of regulators, right? Go to them, reach out to them, apply risk-based approaches. Again, we've been talking about risk-based approaches now for probably, oh my goodness, probably 12, 15 years at this point, right? But let's actually get into applying those and actually reviewing data and assessing risk based upon the merits of your clinical trial design. And at the end of the day, let's collectively reimagine your clinical trial management, reimagine your clinical trial execution and how you could and can do things in a better, more efficient, more effective way. So again, I thank you all for spending some time here with me today. I do want to hand it back to my colleague at X-Talks for any questions that may have come in. And thank you very much.
Indeed. Thank you so much to our speaker, to Jonathan Andrus, for that very wonderful, informative, and insightful presentation. Now, I would like to invite our audience to continue sending in their questions or comments right now using the questions chat window for the Q&A portion of the webinar. So I've already received some questions and we can begin with those. Jonathan?
Great.
All right. So the first question I have here is, don't you think the flexibility varies significantly by division? My division is rigid and unhelpful.
Yes, it certainly can. I guess it depends on what specifically your question is. If it's more broad-based around certain technologies or certain approaches for how you want to go about doing a particular, given clinical trial. I think just like anything in life, right? Some people, some groups, some functions sometimes are much more open to engagement and open to being helpful. So I would just encourage you to, even look out and around different contacts within that division, reach out to other colleagues in other industry, or even reach out. I'll just, my contact details are in this webinar. I'm more than happy, as well as I mentioned, I have quite a few connections within a variety of different regulatory agencies, and more than happy to assist in however I can. But you're right, just like in any aspect of life, there's sometimes folks or teams within a larger organization that are more helpful than others. But generally speaking, I found them to be much more open to dialogue and discussion than they ever have, at least in the many, many years I've been involved in industry.
And another question that we have here is, if I have a question about a new technology like an AI application that doesn't seem to be addressed by existing regulations or regulatory guidance, how can I get feedback from regulators?
Yeah, especially around AI. I'll quote specifically a gentleman from the German health authority, BfArM, and there they talk a lot about quality by design, taking a look at what are the inputs, what are the outputs, what are you trying to accomplish with the AI tool, and really look at it from that perspective. So there is the concept of at least kind of user acceptance type testing around that. That's what I've seen specifically around AI. As I mentioned, there is a notice and comment period right now on a guidance that FDA issued around artificial intelligence. So if you've not read that, I would definitely seek out some of those guidance documents that exist out there, because again, I know many folks, even contacts and friends that I have in industry, are using AI for a variety of activities. So that would be my response to that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that response. And let's take a look at another question that we have here. And this is asking, when it comes to reducing source data verification, the benefits seem obvious and support from regulators has been explicit. So why do you think the industry continues to resist adoption?
My honest, unfiltered answer is that I think organizations, large organizations, probably more so than smaller ones that are more nimble and maybe open to different approaches for data collection, is that so many millions of dollars and millions of person hours have been poured into creating and using different e-clinical systems and technologies over the years, and then the corresponding people and processes that correlate with that. And I think that there is an absolute probably resistance to wanting to back away from that and look for better approaches and better ways of executing clinical trials. And so I think there's a lot that has to do with legacy approach that's just there and will take a while to begin to kind of unfold. What's interesting though is I was in a recent meeting where I was with a global head of data management for one of the top 5 pharma companies in the world. And during that conversation, it was interesting because it was made clear that ultimately that organization saw the ultimate demise or the kind of waning away of electronic data capture tools, and it's going to be more focused on gaining access directly to site data, directly accessing patient data, and cutting out some of these redundant transcribed type tools and technologies that just create some inefficiencies. So I think it's things like that over time that will begin to chip away at some of these legacy models.
Thank you very much for that answer. And moving to the next question. This question is asking if there can be some hitches in virtual data collection. Is there anything regulators are putting in place to ease data collection virtually?
I'm not sure what hitches means.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll try and interpret what I think it might mean. Is that maybe I don't know. I mean, hitches could mean a couple of different things, but I mean, regulators are clear on the fact that as you design your clinical trial protocol, right, as you lay out your time and events schedule and you lay out kind of how those data are being collected, if you read kind of from top to bottom and left to right, as you look at your study design, it's identifying what elements of the study need to be conducted in a physical site, right? So maybe during the screening and enrollment period of that clinical trial, I physically have to come into a facility. But maybe for visits 2, 3, and 4, we can do just like we're doing right now, right? I can see you, you can see me, I can kind of go over different elements during a virtual visit. FDA and other regulatory agencies absolutely, encourage that and allow for that to occur. Essentially no different than what you would do if you met with your primary care provider, right, in a virtual telehealth situation, which even myself, right, I've done that many times, certainly starting with COVID, but even beyond that, if it's just a routine like medication check or medication follow-up, why can't I do a virtual visit like this as opposed to physically having to go into there? So I'm not aware of any hitches that would be further easing of that, because I think there's already the understanding by industry that you can use a variety of different visit types, right? Virtual, on-site, even at home medical research nurses going out to visit with Jonathan in my home, maybe to collect blood or to do blood pressure, to do different vital signs activities. So I'm not aware of any hurdles, if you will, or hitches that regulators have put into place.
And the next question here relates to a question that we had earlier. And again, this talks about when introducing process changes in my organization, I frequently encounter resistance from our internal QA team because it hasn't been done before. So what is the best way to approach pushing back?
Yeah. I mean, for example, hopefully I've given you some elements here today in this webinar that you can kind of refer to and point to. This isn't to be confrontational with your regulatory or QA team within your organization, but I would challenge them or encourage them to provide or to seek specific regulatory instances, both in terms of a regulatory guidance or a predicate rule, to be able to point to and say that this is why we are, as an organization, can't do this because it violates this particular thing. Because what you have to get away from is my own opinion, right? Because if I said, oh no, we can't do a wearable or a sensor because I think that that's going to cause compliance issues. Well, fine, that's your opinion, and maybe we need to do a small pilot on something before we do it at full scale. But where is the regulatory requirement that they're speaking to, right? So I would challenge, I would encourage you to challenge them to provide you with specific examples of things where you're failing to comply with something, right? If you get pushback or you get questions from your in-house QA or regulatory teams.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much once again, Jonathan, for that very insightful presentation and for providing answers to our audience questions. We have now reached the end of the webinar. If we couldn't attend to your questions, the team at Creo may follow up with you, or if you have any further questions, you can direct them to the email address displayed on your screen. I'd like to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen. Your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve on our webinars. Now, I'm about to send you a link in your chat box, and you'll be able to view the recording of this event on that page. You can also share this link with your colleagues so that when they register for the recording there, they can view it as well. So I do encourage you to do so. Now, please join us in thanking once again our speaker for today, Jonathan Andrus. We hope you found this webinar informative. On behalf of the team here at X-Talks, thank you once again for joining, and until next time, please take care and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.